Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. Just want to make sure that I do my greetings properly. It's 9:03 p.m. where I am at, so thank you so much for joining in. My name is Edwin Sarmiento. Hopefully you can see my slide there. Um, I have been doing migrations since, what, early 2000s? And the one thing that I notice, and this is from more than hundreds to close to 1,000 migrations, is that while the technology might evolve, the principles and the processes remain the same. You got my contact information over there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and also let me know if I'm having a little bit of a delay or lag in both the slideshow as well as the audio because I'm still testing my internet connection. Anyway, this talk is all about migrating on-premises SQL Server to Azure, and that could mean Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL running on VMs or SQL Server running on Azure VMs, and I'll let you know why I kind of skipped the Azure SQL DB part of it later on as part of the presentation. Let me get started though. We recently sold our house. Yay! Selling a house. If you've sold your house or you moved different apartment, different houses, in our case, different countries. I think we've done it like 3 times now. I'm originally from the Philippines, moved to Singapore, moved to Canada, and then from Canada, Ottawa, moved to the house that we sold. So technically, we've moved like 3 or 4 times now. And when you're moving houses, there are so many things that you have to really consider. Part of that is thinking about what stuff do I need to bring with me. I remember when we were moving from the Philippines to Singapore, we barely had anything. Barely. Moving from Singapore to Canada, we had to get rid of so many things. Because part of that is also thinking about a lot of different things when you're moving. Stuff like, do I really need this? Or is it just junk that I want to keep for the rest of my life? Because when you keep the stuff and when you decide you want to keep that stuff, you have to factor in your logistics, like boxes, for instance. The boxes, the more stuff you need to take with you, the more boxes that you need. In addition to the boxes, of course, you need to coordinate the logistics for moving those boxes. We had to rent a storage facility in Ottawa for stuff like this. I will have to say, picking the storage facility and estimating how much space you need depends on whether you want to take everything with you or not. Okay. Not only that, you also have to worry about the moving mechanism. By the way, this is not sponsored by U-Haul. Just saying that, yes, not even Daimon. I don't know if you have Daimon in Alberta. But the thing is, if you're only taking, a couple of boxes, maybe less than a dozen boxes, you may be fine with a mini van. Good enough. But if you're taking like 20, 30 boxes or 40 boxes and you want to include your bed frame, your fridge, everything, you may need the largest truck in there. Okay. If there's something that I've learned from moving is number one, you don't ever do it on a weekend because you're gonna get a ton of back aches and muscle pains as part of the move. And number two is you always have to think about the stuff that you currently have and whether or not you want to bring them with you all the time. Or you may want to decide to do an inventory of what you have and ask yourself, do I really need this? Or do I not need this? There's a lot of similarities when you're doing migration as well as when you're moving houses, because I've seen so many cases of database migrations in the past, whether on-premises, physical to virtual, virtual to public cloud, where they just take everything with them. And then they're realizing, wait, we're migrating a 27 terabyte worth of database. Do you really need all that data? Right? So just giving you an idea of what happened to me when I moved. But also part of it is understanding what you need to consider when you're moving databases. And not just moving as migrating, because more often than not, the migration comes with an upgrade process as well. So you're not just migrating, you're also migrating and upgrading. Okay, so when you're looking at migrating SQL Server to Azure, coming from an on-premises environment to Azure or any public cloud infrastructure, even whether that's AWS or GCP, but we're specifically just pointing to Azure at this point, these are the things that you have to consider. Number one is planning, two, considerations. We're looking at the tools and strategies, and number four, resources. I am going to focus on the things that we technical professionals barely, or if not barely, rarely spend most of our time on. Because most of the time as technical professionals, we spend so much time on the tools and strategies, on the how-to, but I want to focus on the first two things here, the planning and the consideration. Let's start with planning. I love this quote from Winston Churchill: "Those who plan do better than those who do not plan, even though they rarely stick to their plan." I don't know, maybe there's something about the process of planning where we can immediately visualize what would happen even though we haven't done it yet. So it's programming our brain to find options, strategies that we've never thought of outside of the plan because we simply went through the process of planning. I'm huge on planning. And because I specialize in high availability and disaster recovery, my goal is always to mitigate risk, lower the risk, and you do that by doing a ton of planning and also a ton of testing to make sure that your plan actually works. I don't want to sound like a sales engineer from Microsoft selling Azure services, but this is kind of like mandatory because you want to know where you're going to. It's like moving houses, right? You want to know where the house is, where the location is, where the what are available for the property that you're moving into. Kind of the same. So let's have a look at what are commonly known as two subdivisions within any public cloud provider. You have your platform as a service and your infrastructure as a service. We broke it down into two because early in the days of, I remember we were having this conversation with Bob Ward before the past time, and like, remember the time when it was called SQL Azure? So you have like the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. With infrastructure as a service, you have your SQL Server and Azure VMs, no different from you running this on-premises on a VMware or Hyper-V, Nutanix even. It's just that the virtual machines are sitting on Azure. And then you have Azure SQL Database, where the database is the only thing that's available to you. Anything that is outside of the database, like for instance, managing memory, CPU, storage, is done for you by a provider, in this case, Microsoft. Recently, and I say recently, meaning less than 5 or 7 years ago, when Microsoft started offering Azure SQL managed instance. In fact, the reason I was in Poland was I was talking to the Azure SQL managed instance team on some of the improvements that they're making with a product as more and more customers are integrating their databases and running their databases in Azure SQL managed instance. So let's have a look at these two categories, the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. The way I look at this is when I'm choosing between the two, the first thing that I think about is administration. Your typical administration, your care and feeding, the way you manage the environment from the disk, the network, compute resources, to the granular details of how you manage the instance and the database. With infrastructure as a service, it's like, well, whatever you can do on premises with SQL Server running on VMs, you can do that with infrastructure as a service. You have full control. other than the placements of the VMs on which specific physical machine it's running on top of. With platform as a service, you really don't have full control of that. It's the vendor taking care of it. But beyond, the typical day-to-day administration, you have to consider stuff like, can I make modifications to some of the settings? Like for instance, with infrastructure as a service, you have physical control, and I put an asterisk there, meaning, again, whatever you are able to do with a SQL Server running on a VMware VM, a Nutanix VM, a Hyper-V VM, you can do with an Azure virtual machine and SQL Server. So you can customize the way you install it. You can use an INI file. You can do whatever you want with it the way you've done it on premises with your virtual machines. With platform as a service, not so much. Okay, whether it's Azure SQL Managed Instance where you have control over the instance but not anything outside of the instance, and Azure SQL DB where you have control over the database but not necessarily outside of the database. Okay, with Azure SQL Managed Instance, stuff like TempDB, you can, but then with Azure SQL DB, you can't really do anything about TempDB. Okay. In addition to administration, you're looking at the cost. The bean counters, the accountants, your CFO. This is what they look at most of the time. And they're looking at the dollar values. I'm looking at more than just the dollar values. The bill at the end of the month is what they normally look at. I look at cost in terms of not just the utilization of the resource, but also you managing the resource on the cloud. Because we're not going to be eliminating, and of course, these are the common things that we as tech professional look at, like bandwidth, pricing, backup retention. When you tweak these settings, like I want to increase the bandwidth, well, you are also going to be increasing the cost. I want to improve IOPS. You're going to be increasing the cost, right? With Azure VMs, infrastructure as a service offering, you're typically looking at licensing, compute, and storage. But again, these are the things that we present to our CFO or the accountants when we're looking at cost. I also look at administration as a cost because we are going to be spending time managing these resources. We are going to be putting in the time, the effort, and that counts as cost, as far as I'm concerned, unless you want to work for free. I don't. Okay, but that is part of the cost you have to think about. Okay, not only that, the risk when you're putting your databases on either the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, the risk counts as a cost. That's because, of course, when you're taking care of everything, you have full control over everything. So you're taking on the risk. But when somebody else is taking care of, like with Azure, Microsoft's taking care of the data center, Microsoft's taking care of the physical hardware, well, there's still the risk of the hardware breaking and failing. How do you count that as a cost towards administration? And of course, your SLA, because in my case, this is what I'm really particular about. Specializing in high availability and disaster recovery, I'm very particular about service level agreements. Okay, the 3 nines, the 4 nines, the 5 nines. It's easy to claim, yeah, we can do 5 nines, but I'm pretty sure you've had those experiences when Microsoft would send an announcement. Oh, we're doing maintenance. We're doing maintenance between Friday and Sunday during these times, and you kind of wonder, wait. I did sign up for like 99.9% SLA, and then they're telling me they'll be down for like 4 hours. That's a risk. And that's part of the service level agreement. Okay. You have these numbers, like I said, asterisk, meaning you have to consider other things as part of this. Like for instance, with virtual machines, virtual machine level by itself, you have like 99.9% uptime. with like premium disk. If you want to increase the availability, you have to configure high availability for your SQL Server by providing 2 VMs, maybe provisioning a failover clustered instance or an availability group where the nodes are in an availability set, so that Microsoft would then move those VMs to 2 different data centers. Same region, different data centers, of course, with a complexity of configuring multi-subnet as part of that. Okay, with the platform as a service, they have guaranteed service. In fact, I was talking to one of the senior program managers at Microsoft, and he was saying, yeah, we actually are on call with Azure SQL Managed Instance, meaning if we get an alert, we jump on it immediately. That's part of what they offer as the SQL Managed Instance offering. So these are the things that I think about when I'm moving customers to the cloud. And in some cases, customers don't even think about these. I just give them a nudge on what to think about. Because again, it's their business, not mine. It's their databases, not mine. It's the risk that they have to take on. Because every decision that you make for your databases, for the business, comes with a risk. So the common question that I get is, which one? Am I doing Azure SQL DB? Am I doing Azure SQL Managed Instance? Am I doing SQL Server on Azure VMs? Well, these are the things that I look at when it comes to choosing which one. And keep in mind, we're migrating on-premises SQL Server to Azure. Okay. For new deployments, SaaS-based design, you can pick and choose between Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. If you're looking at requiring tight control, or you want to use existing features, use infrastructure as a service. And by the way, these are common recommendations from Microsoft. In fact, when you ask them, this is what they tell you. Here's the way I think about it. If you're migrating your on-premises SQL Server databases to Azure, one thing is for sure, that's not a new app. That's probably a 25-year-old app that you're migrating. Okay, that is probably a legacy app using very old drivers that you cannot even find because the vendor of the driver decided we want to discontinue this, so you're just keeping everything up and running. Your only option, as far as I'm concerned, is Azure SQL or SQL Server on Azure VMs. Kind of like a lift and shift thing. Well, although I'm not really a big fan of lift and shift, Microsoft would recommend you doing lift and shift because that's the most expensive way to do it. And of course, the more expensive it is, the more money they make. Okay. So your only option really is SQL Server on Azure VMs or SQL Managed Instance. These are your only two options. I have yet to see a customer that has legacy app that uses SQL Server database as a backend move to Azure SQL Database. Why? Again, very, very, very old, to a point where you can even identify the original version of SQL Server they use for the app if you dig enough on the metadata behind the database. I've seen the SQL 2019 database that still has some remnants of SQL 2000, and you know for a fact that that's not a new design. So there is no way that you can move that over to Azure SQL Database. In addition, of course, some IOPS requirements and like compatibility issues with the code. More often than not, they would land on a SQL Server running on Azure virtual machines, or if they've done a lot of the testing, making sure that the compatibility with the application is guaranteed, meaning they've tested it, they've done user acceptance testing, and they've validated everything. The closest to a platform as a service offering that you can land on is Azure SQL Managed Instance, but even that is still restricted. Okay, so you're looking at these two things, and also taking into account documentation, which we all love to do. Pretty sure everybody would disagree with me on that. Nobody loves writing documentation. But the thing is this, especially when you're dealing with legacy application, you want to know, wait a second, did I miss a driver that I need to install in order for my application to connect properly to my database. Oh, am I missing a configuration setting on the SQL Server instance in order for my client application to work? We wouldn't know unless we have documentation. Actually, you're looking at documentation in order for you to do the migration, as well as making sure that the settings, configuration settings, are replicated over, or in some cases, might not even make sense to replicate the configuration settings. Remember, moving houses, you might not need certain configuration settings because, well, the new version of SQL Server already takes care of that setting for you. Whereas in the older version, you have to manually do it, like some of the trace flags that we turned on in the older version that are now embedded within the newer version. And then you have your strategy. How are you going to do the migration? Of course, part of that is backup and rollback. Somebody commented on one of my LinkedIn posts a couple of weeks ago and says, I'm not quite sure why your strategy is like this. And I responded by saying, well, I assume I will always have rollbacks, meaning I assume that nothing will ever work. So I plan everything as if something bad will happen. Okay, I'm optimistic, but my optimism is based on reality. I know for a fact that I can do this with my eyes closed, but I also know for a fact that things will never be perfect. And so I have to plan for rollback. So how can you roll back if you don't have a backup plan? Part of that is also testing. How would you know that your strategy actually works if you've only done it once? How would you know how long the rollback would take if you've never tested it? These are some of the things that you have to consider, especially, like I said, when you're dealing with highly available systems, whether failover clustered instance, availability groups, you have to test. And part of the testing is how long does it take to roll back? Because your rollback is part of your SLA. Okay, I always look at this when I'm doing a migration. I call it the migration project timeline. I'm simplifying it, but of course, there's more detail into this. Whenever I step in and do a migration and act like a kind of like a project manager, first is the pre-migration phase. This is what you prepare for. You're choosing what platform, you're choosing the strategy, you're preparing the resources, you're cutting out or carving out time in order for you to do the testing. Okay, then there's the actual migration. Notice that the pre-migration is bigger than the actual migration. And then you have the post-migration where you're testing, hey, are the applications connecting properly? Have we smoke tested? Have we validated user acceptance? Are we good to go before we officially say we cut over to production and we start stabilizing? Notice the subdivisions and the sections, the size of the sections, because I spend more time on the pre-migration phase. When I'm doing pre-migration, meaning I'm spinning up a new, let's say, on-premises, I am moving to an Azure SQL Managed instance. I'm spinning up an Azure SQL Managed instance. I'm doing the pre-rec, meaning if I will replicate the database over, I do that, backup, copy, restore, or whatever tool. I'm actually doing that and not causing any downtime or issues in production, meaning business as usual. Users don't even recognize that something is going on. I'm testing, validating, not even touching production, meaning, again, the users don't even know that you're doing preparation, which is in pre-migration. With actual migration, it should be as short and as quick as you possibly can. Quick. Meaning, in a pre-migration stage, you've already documented things that didn't work, you fixed it, you tried it, you did it again a couple of times, guarantee that you can do this repeatedly, even though you're only going to do it once to cut over to production. The actual migration should only take a few minutes, maximum 1 hour, if you've thoroughly tested it. And then stabilize. These are the two sections that I focus on: pre-migration and stabilize. One, I want to make sure that the users don't even recognize, they're not even aware that something is happening under the covers. Of course, those people who are part of the project plan know exactly what's going on, but from the point of view of the end user, everything's transparent. Like they go off, they go on their weekend, they come back to work, open their app, it's as if nothing happened. Performance-wise, user experience, everything else feels like nothing happened. But in reality, under the covers, it's running on either Azure SQL Managed Instance or SQL Server running on Azure VM. That's why I spend so much time on these two sections, pre-migration and stabilize, because I want to make sure that I provide the same user experience. And part of that is testing, validating. If something goes wrong, I need to roll back until I know for a fact that I'm ready to cut over to production. Okay. I use what I call PPT manifesto for migration and upgrade. P stands for process. It's a properly defined process. If this is the first time you're doing it, I'm migrating my SQL Server databases on premises to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Well, I have to think about how long does it take for me to replicate the databases on premises to Azure. Of course, you have to do that before you do the actual migration or cutting over to production. So you have to have a defined process. What happens when, or how do we? These are some of the things that you have to consider. The process, once you've outlined it, can be automated using a couple of scripts. That's why I'm huge on properly defining the processes. And then you have your people. When you move to public cloud infrastructures, you now have to think about the other people on a team that need to be a part of this. And don't surprise them by saying, hey, we're doing a migration this weekend. You have to tell them months in advance so that they can prepare ahead of time. Because now we're thinking about other things that we probably didn't think about when we start moving to the cloud. I remember one of the migrations that I did back in, this was 2015 timeframe. Customer was moving to the cloud, they tested everything, and part of that is also migrating and upgrading. That's why I said you have to think about whether you're just migrating or migrating and upgrading. Everything went well pre-migration, they tested, they validated everything. We cut over to production, all of a sudden, the app was so slow. We're thinking, wait, is this the new cardinality estimator? Did we not test this? And all of a sudden they realized, wait a second, we just migrated the database, we did not migrate the app. So the app was still on premises and the database is on the cloud. They did not inform the app team that they should also migrate the app to the cloud. I mean, they don't have to, but then you have to worry about and suffer from the network latency and the performance as a side effect of the network latency between the traffic coming from the app on premises connecting to the database on the cloud. So you have to let them know months in advance that they too have to be a part of this. And again, the last thing I want is for your app team to not be aware that they should also be migrating the apps on the cloud. And of course, the technology. We technology professionals focus more on this, but not on the people and the processes. This is the platform that meets the requirements. And again, at this point, you should be thinking about, do I move to Azure SQL Managed Instance, or do I move to SQL Server on an Azure VM? Okay. I also use what I call the PDA principle for migration and upgrades. P stands for prioritize. You identify and prioritize the workload that you need to migrate based on requirements. I kind of hinted on one of my customers moving a 27 terabyte size databases on the cloud. And I asked them, do you really need all that data? It took them a while to respond. And when I asked, well, what's this 27 terabyte database for? It's for a data warehousing system. And there's a huge table in there that's purely for logging. And I told them, why are you keeping your logging infrastructure inside the same database as your data warehouse? It took them a while to respond. And some said, I don't know. That's the kind of answer that I don't want to hear, because people are just simply doing things because, the previous people or the previous team did it that way. And the people prior to that did it that way. And so they just keep doing things the way it's been done, not realizing that they can actually now, with moving stuff to the cloud, they don't need to put all the logging information inside the database. So you identify and prioritize the workload that you need to migrate based on requirements. Because now you will be paying for that data that you're keeping or moving to the cloud, regardless of whether or not you're going to use it. Okay? Not all workloads are created equal. You have stuff like dev, stage, or production. Some customers would start with dev and staging. They'll keep production on premises for the time being until they've built the processes. They've informed the people, because you have to prepare that way ahead of time. So they start off with dev and staging, maybe testing environment on Azure. And once they're comfortable with it, once they've written the documentation, once they have the processes in place, that's the time they start planning to move their production environment to the cloud. There's also your recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, and SLA. Again, not all workloads are created equal. And I have customers who have moved their development and staging environments to Azure, but their production are still on premises, mainly because they have very strict RPO, RTO, and SLA requirements that they cannot rely on public cloud infrastructures to meet those requirements. Okay, for dev and staging, sure, it's fine, no big deal. But for production, they're keeping their workloads on premises because they have very strict RPO, RTO, and SLA. Number 2 is decide. That's the D on the PDA principle. Decide on the best solution and strategy based on the results of the discovery from the previous phase. And that's why you have to first prioritize, identify, and prioritize what your workloads will be. Part of that is also identifying what's the target destination. Is the target destination SQL Server and Azure VM, or is it Azure SQL Managed Instance? Okay, currently working with a customer who are running their workloads on Azure SQL Managed Instance, and they're having a ton of performance problems. And the first question I asked was, well, why are you running on the Azure SQL Managed Instance? Well, it is what our vendor recommended. Really? That's what your vendor... Does your vendor know exactly what your performance profile looks like? Does your vendor know Azure SQL Managed Instance inside and out? And that's a common misconception. Wait, the vendor is recommending that we move to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Is your vendor going to support you when you have issues with Azure SQL Managed Instance? That's actually the reason why they came to me, because their vendor cannot support them with their performance issues running on Azure SQL Managed Instance. So that in itself, make sure that you're making your decisions based on the results of the discovery from the previous phase. Not because your vendor recommends that they want to move you to Azure SQL Managed Instance. And that's most of the time, that's the most important question I ask. Is your vendor going to support you end to end based on their recommendation? Because if not, I would rather move to a platform where I know I can support myself or my team can support that platform. Okay? Because vendors can recommend any platform, but then when you ask them what's your capabilities, they can't even respond properly. So you're looking at stuff like, again, when you're moving from on-premises to Azure, your only two options, because you're moving legacy or old apps, Azure VMs or Azure SQL Managed Instance. Then you're looking at budget, of course. This is something that, again, your CFOs, your accountants, this is the only thing that they care about. But we know for a fact that we're looking beyond just the operational cost. Sure, you do not have capital expenditures of licensing, hardware costs, data center costs, but you still have to look at operations and maintenance cost as your data grows, as your requirements evolve. Okay, and then you're looking at both, or are you looking at migrating, or are you also doing upgrades with migration? Because those are two different things. Okay, I've worked with customers who simply did migrate. That's it. It's like taking a database backup, restoring it on the cloud, whether it's Azure SQL Managed Instance or VMs, and that's it. I've also worked with customers where, hey, we need to move to the cloud, but we're no longer in mainstream support, so we need to do an upgrade. If you're doing both, you have to plan for both. The last thing you want is for you to migrate to Azure, upgrade to whatever version that you want to be on, so you can be fully supported, not realizing your client applications don't support them. In fact, I've worked with 3 customers recently where, yeah, we're moving to Azure, we're moving to SQL Server on Azure VM. So, and by the way, we still need to be on SQL 2019. SQL 2019 ended its mainstream support early this year. Why do you want to move to SQL 2019? Well, our vendors only support SQL 2019. Yep. So are you telling me your vendor will support you in case SQL Server doesn't work? So you have to think about that. You have to consider who is supporting what. To plan for whether you're only doing migration or you're doing migration and upgrade as part of it. Okay. And then are you going to move only a few, or do you want to move all of your databases? Again, that 27 terabyte database that one of my customers wanted to move, I told them, look, there are other ways for you to do logging for your app. You don't have to store the log inside SQL Server. There's other ways, okay? Not realizing the 27 terabyte size database, about 2 to 3 terabytes of that is logging information. So you imagine how much data they can move, or the amount of data they can save. So 27 minus 3, that's 24. That's 3 terabytes worth of logging information that they don't have to maintain when they move to the cloud. Okay, are you doing it because you have the staff, you have the capabilities, or you're outsourcing? And of course, when you're outsourcing, part of the question that you need to ask is, are they going to help you once you've cut over to production? And also setting the expectations, okay, like issue resolution before migration and validation after migration. I'm going to focus on this a little more in a couple of slides, but the key thing here is really just setting expectations. Who's responsible for what now? Because when everything's on premises, we, the entire team, is responsible for everything. With a cloud, well, who's responsible for what? And again, I'll talk more about this in a few more slides. Okay, so P for prioritize, D for decide, A is for act. Move towards the direction of your decisions. At this point, you've already thought of the strategy, you've already have the resources, you've already planned it, you have a project plan. You're now spending time on the pre-migration phase without causing any issues to your production environment. Again, business as usual. Users don't even know that you're doing work as part of the migration. So part of that is, well, you define a migration strategy. Is it as simple as a backup copy restore, or is it going to be an Azure SQL Managed Instance link between on-premises and Azure SQL Managed Instance? Is it log shipping? Is it third party? Totally up to you. But you have to define a migration strategy. But that also needs to be dependent on your SLA. You don't want to be doing a backup copy restore, not realizing, oh, my full backup takes like forever to move to the cloud. Then you implement the solution. if you're coming from a standalone instance on premises, moving to the cloud, do you want to be still running standalone instances, or do you now require high availability? That's part of implementing the solution. And then you define operational procedures. Remember what I said in the previous slide where you're setting expectations? Because part of your operational procedures is monitoring. In your on-premises deployment, you're implementing monitoring, you get an alert, you or the other team responsible for that alert gets the alert. So if the issue happens to be a network bandwidth issue, the network team receives the alert, they act on it, meaning they respond, they fix the issue, and that's defining operational procedures as well. So now in this case, when you have network issues in the cloud, who is going to be receiving that alert from your monitoring tool? What's the SLA for responding to that alert? What's the turnaround for responding to that alert and fixing that issue? Okay, and then training your staff. Some people would say, hey, we're offloading our day-to-day operations to the cloud. Sure, but that doesn't mean you don't have to learn what's going on the cloud. Like even as simple as, hey, I need to connect to my Azure resources. Do I need site-to-site VPN? Oh, by the way, I never told my staff that I need to do site-to-site VPN. Or do you need to do a point-to-site? Or do I just publicly expose everything to the cloud so that everybody can access it? Even as simple as connectivity to your Azure resources, you now have to let your staff know about the process. Otherwise, again, tying these all together, I get an alert, a monitoring solution sends me an alert. I need to respond within a certain SLA, but I can't even figure out how to connect. So now it's eating up the time, or I'm eating up the time that's supposed to be for issue resolution when I'm spending 17 minutes trying to figure out how to connect to my Azure resources. Okay. And again, I'm just tying all of these things together because now your existing operational procedures, your existing issue resolution and escalation procedures will have to change. Some of those you cannot do anything about. Like if Microsoft decides, hey, we are doing maintenance on this particular Azure data region or data center in this region, you can't do anything about that but to wait. And unless you've planned for it as part of your solution, then you will be down for as long as the Microsoft data center is down. Unless, again, you've implemented a solution for high availability, plus you've also paid for it. Yes, there's cost, always. Some of the considerations. So we've talked about the planning. Let's talk about considerations. I think I remember mentioning the story about one of the early migrations I did back in 2015, where the customer decided, hey, we're moving everything to the cloud, and after production cutover, they forgot to migrate their applications as well. You got to ask the question, are you moving your apps to Azure? If the app team has no plan at all, there's no point in migrating your databases to Azure. Because the bandwidth, the network latency between on-premises apps to your SQL Server databases on Azure is going to kill performance. So get them on board if you decide you want to move. And sometimes when the CTO decides, hey, we want to do this, the beauty of working with CTOs is that they have a big picture vision of what needs to happen. So it's not just, hey, we're moving databases. No, we're moving everything. And although we're moving everything as a group. So we're not just moving databases, we're moving the apps that connect to the databases, some middle tier that the apps use to connect to the databases. Make sure that you're moving your apps to Azure. Okay? How are they going to connect? Have you configured network connectivity between your Azure resources from where your apps are to where your databases are? And typically, this is a network administrator task, but Now that you're operating on Azure, you have to be aware of the fact that there are network security groups or firewall rules. There are multiple subnets or multiple networks, and you have to connect them. You have to make sure that the traffic goes through. How are they going to connect? Okay, we're not even talking about upgrading your apps or modernizing your apps. We're just simply moving the apps to the cloud, make sure that the apps can connect to the databases once you move your databases to Azure. How are they going to authenticate? Entra ID, Windows authentication. If your apps use Windows authentication, have you talked to your Active Directory guys about extending Active Directory onto Azure? Or are you still going to be using SQL Server authentication? Or that's also making sure that you've implemented encryption as part of that, even though everything is on Azure, you still have to implement some form of encryption. This is huge. What about app compatibility? And let me throw in there app support. Okay. Most of the time, and I see this most of the time when I'm doing client application or database migrations, is that the only thing that the app team would do is to open the app, make sure that they can connect. They don't do thorough testing. They don't do thorough functionality, thorough smoke testing of the app to a point where 7 months down the road is the only time that they would find out one of the app features don't work because there was a feature that was implemented in SQL Server that they don't support. But they only found out because they've rarely used that feature, and all of a sudden it's a mission critical feature. Kind of like, yeah, we'll run a report and we'll use this feature, and then all of a sudden the feature doesn't work because they've never tested it. You got to think about app compatibility. Oh, by the way, we're looking at tasks while you're doing migration. This is post-migration. We're looking at operations. You cut over to production. What are the things that you have to consider? How will you monitor? Are you moving, or are you going to be reusing apps that you use on premises so that you can monitor cloud resources? Can your monitoring tool work, or will it work on Azure? Most of the monitoring tools have support for public cloud infrastructures like AWS and Azure, but you have to make some tweaks. The good thing about that is it's the same monitoring tool. Okay, and as I've already mentioned in a couple of slides before, other than making sure that your monitoring tools are supported in Azure, is how are you going to be dealing with your backups? Who is going to be responsible for your backups, right? SQL Managed Instance versus Azure SQL, or SQL and Azure VM. SQL Server and Azure VM, that's you. Okay, that's you. You are going to be running backups. You are going to be making sure that they're stored properly, and you're also going to be making sure that you're testing them, because now there's no excuse for not testing them. You can easily spin up a VM, restore, validate, destroy the VM, just so you can test your backups. When you're doing Azure Managed SQL Managed Instance, Microsoft is taking care of that. But you have the responsibility of testing whether or not those actually work. Okay. Part of the monitoring is issue resolution and escalation. When everything's on premises, you get a ticket. Sometimes if you're in an office, you can tap the person who's responsible. Hey, did you see the ticket? Are you working on it? Now, who's getting the ticket? When your monitoring tool picked up an alert and sends an email, who's going to receive it? Microsoft? Or is it you or your team? That is why part of the PDA principle is thinking about redefining your operational procedures and rewriting your escalation and issue resolution processes and documentation. Okay? Because your escalation procedures will be totally different, especially when you no longer have control of the infrastructure. Besides, pretty sure you're not going to be sending those alerts, the monitoring alerts, you're not going to be sending them to Microsoft. You are going to get them and then reevaluate whether or not this is an alert for something that Microsoft is responsible for or your team is supposed to be responsible for. Okay? How will you deal with change management? Yes, when you're not in control of the infrastructure, the way you change something, you modify something. For code deployments, that's pretty straightforward because it's happening within the context of the database. But what about how do we implement patches? Of course, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Microsoft takes care of that. But if you're on SQL Server on Azure VMs, that's your responsibility. And that's part of change management. Okay. How will you deal with maintenance? And again, different platforms, different responsibilities, different maintenance schedules and maintenance procedures. Okay. With Azure SQL Managed Instance, again, Microsoft is taking care of that. SQL Server on Azure VM, that is your responsibility. So you're patching Windows, you're patching SQL Server, you're updating based on Microsoft's cadence on the release of cumulative updates or Windows updates. Oh, and by the way, we're not even talking about when Microsoft decides, hey, we're performing maintenance on this particular data center. Yesterday, we just told you today. Like when Fabric was offline for hours, and they don't even tell you. Tools and strategies. You notice that I don't spend a lot of time on the tools and strategies. Why? This is something that we do every day. And when we're so focused on the tools and strategies that we forget there are more important things outside of the technology and the tools. But because we're geeks, we need to. We're looking at a couple of things. One, the map toolkit. Anybody of you familiar with map toolkit? I've used it a couple of times for doing SQL Server inventory. But in my case, I now use this to do an assessment for not just the SQL Server database, but also the app that connects to the SQL Server database. Again, you don't just migrate your databases to Azure and leaving the app on premises. There is a full-blown version of the map toolkit called Azure Migrate, kind of like the next generation of map toolkit. You can use Data Migration Assistant, although I rarely use this in Azure Data Studio because it's been deprecated. In fact, I've done this presentation so many times now, and then earlier this year when Microsoft decided, hey, we are going to deprecate, and we're no longer going to be continuing development on Azure Data Studio, I'm like, okay. Microsoft decided they are going to discontinue Azure Data Studio. And of course, DBA tool, my favorite. I did this presentation when a few of the Microsoft team, specifically the Azure Migrate team, or Azure SQL Managed Instance team was in the room, and they were recommending their tools. Sure, of course, you're recommending your tools. Have you tried DBA tools yet? They're way better than your tools. I try to be nice. Trying to be as Canadian as I can possibly be. With Azure Migrate, it will, especially, this is more targeted to data center migrations and not just SQL Server to Azure migrations. But remember what I said earlier, there's no point in migrating your databases if you're not migrating your apps. So part of this is it will get you to download a VM if you're coming from VMware or Hyper-V. It will get you to download a VM. It will run an assessment on your entire infrastructure. You can segment that according to either Active Directory organizational unit or even network subnets, so you can target specific servers and not your entire data center. Okay. If you choose to use the option to profile performance workloads, it will. You run the VM, it will collect as much information as it can possibly collect. And based on the workload, of course, you assume that it's a normal day-to-day, normal business operation performance workload. Based on what it captures, it will recommend the compute, storage, and network resources that you need for your destination. Okay, so it's not just, hey, do a lift and shift, whatever you have on premises, you can do it on Azure, But sometimes that's so expensive. Good thing I don't work for Microsoft. I always recommend that customers reevaluate their workloads, because sometimes you're over provisioning on premises and then you move to Azure and you're doing a lift and shift. That becomes even more expensive. So you reevaluate and provision based on current performance workloads with the plan to eventually grow, because of course, the more the business grows, the more data you collect, the more performance you have to experience. So you have to plan for that as well. So that's Azure Migrate. It's the Azure version of the Map Toolkit from way back when. Map Toolkit is still a thing, but this is mostly for on-premises to Azure migration. With DBA tools, you have other options like backup DBA database or restore DBA database. Again, I'm a big fan of doing the preparation, the pre-migration beforehand. So I would define the process of how I do the strategy. Once I have the strategy in place, I will look at the steps and see, hey, how can I automate this? And then I will run the automation script once, make sure that it works. Second time around, I'm timing to make sure that I can factor in how long did it take to complete the entire thing, how long did it take for me to cut over, how long did it take for me to stabilize, and everything's automated. That's why I love using DBA tools. And the good thing about this is you can mix other PowerShell commandlets alongside with DBA tools, okay, like or start DBA migration. I'm just a big fan of automation. I'm lazy. Resources. Map Toolkit is still a thing. You want to do that, or Azure Migrate, Data Migration Assistant. For the actual migration, again, this will depend on your strategy. And once you're clear on your strategy, you start using the tools. You use the tools, like in my case, I'm a big fan of automation. That's why I added DBA tools in here. Once you know the tools, you test it, you create the process, and then figure out which steps in the process you can automate, write the script, rerun everything using the automated script, time it, test it, make sure that it's repeatable. And then when you're ready to cut over, you just run it, go grab some coffee, and wait until it's finished. Of course, on the assumption that you've timed everything so that when it's going beyond the amount of time it took for you when you were doing testing, you know for a fact that you need to start looking into it. That is about it for all the things that I could share with you on the migrating SQL Server on-premises to Azure, specifically for your databases, but I've also considered things outside of your database that you need to consider.
Cool, great. Thank you, Edwin. Yeah, thank you. Some questions there. So you mentioned about there's different types of Azure SQL options, SQL Server options, right? Some are the managed instance, you run it on a VM, or even just Azure SQL database itself. When a lot of companies, when they start thinking about migrating into Azure from on-premise, they have purchased licenses with Microsoft, right, on SQL servers. How do they translate in each of the scenarios there?
That's the beauty of using the Azure Migrate. With Azure Migrate, you have the option to provide, hey, do I have existing licenses? Can I do a bring your own license? Based on the information you provide, and of course, the destination as well. With SQL Server on Azure VMs, you're looking at version upgrades as well, because you're in control of that. With Azure SQL Managed Instance, Microsoft dictates the version underneath it. So when you're using Azure Migrate, and this is one of the reasons I highly recommend it, is you're getting an idea of, this is what I have, these are the licenses, I'm going to move the licenses over to Azure, what are my options? And then based on that, they will also provide you with the compute, storage, and networking resources, plus the calculation of the monthly cost associated with it.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Which
You mentioned
also translates to, hey, now I'm starting to become like an accountant, not just a DBA. Which again, this is in the era of public cloud infrastructures, you have to think beyond your day-to-day role, because now you will have to start thinking about the financial implications of your decision. If you're going to do a VM to VM migration, because again, it's easy when everything's on premises, you don't care about performance because you already paid for the resource. In the cloud, you want better performance, oh, you have to pay for it. So gone are the days when I can just run a stored procedure, takes 45 minutes. If I want to improve that, either I would increase the compute, storage, and networking resource and pay more, or I have to improve my stored procedure.
right. It really changes the conversation on your scaling and capability of your SQL Server. Is no longer a static thing. It's something more dynamic than before. And an awesome presentation. Thank you so much for your time sharing the migrations from on-premise to Azure with us on the SQL Server end. We learned a lot, very valuable experience and your knowledge that you're sharing with us. First, thank you very much around that. Also, I think we're going to take a quick summer break for the Edmonton Data Group. We'll come back in the September time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.